everybody. Hello, hello. Okay, so we can get started, I guess.
Let's do it.
All right, I'm Paige Bollinger. I'm a lawyer. I represent Decasonic in, their various investments, and I work for Coke Fairchild, Morgan and Bears here in Chicago. I'll let our lovely panelists introduce themselves quickly, and then we can get started because I know this is probably a hotly anticipated panel.
Start with me?
Yeah, sure.
I'm Dan Gunsberg. I'm a co-founder of Hero Network. We were building a decentralized derivatives primitive on the Solana blockchain. My background has largely been in proprietary derivatives trading. I've been in the Chicago derivatives space really since 1994, so about 28 years, and very happy to be here.
My name is Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. We do political intelligence for the terminal and markets. Prior to that, I was a lobbyist with the Chicago Merc and Bank of America. Grew up here in Chicago. It's the first time I've been back since COVID. So Paul, thank you very much for the invite. The city looks amazing.
Hi everyone, I'm State Representative Margaret Croak, represent Gold Coast, Old Town, Lincoln Park area. I stumbled upon a white paper that the state of Illinois did on cryptocurrency, found it incredibly interesting, and then began introducing legislation around various regulations that I think are both good for business, but mostly good for our consumers as well. So that's how I got into this space.
Cool. All right, so we have a couple things we want to talk about today. We're going to talk about the state of the blockchain regulation, which is, there's a lot there, like a huge swath of different topics we can talk about. We're going to talk about how builders, if you were a builder of a protocol or a product or any kind of cryptocurrency related company or blockchain company in this room, how are you going to think about that? And so I think it'd be great to get Dan's perspective on that, especially as an entrepreneur in the space himself. And then what else is on the horizon? There's a couple of bills that are probably, politically speaking, not going to make it through the circulating around in the Senate and right now, but they're worth talking about and what they're sort of bringing to the table. And I would love to get Margaret to her perspective specifically on state legislation. She's brought forth state legislation here in Illinois, and just her perspective on what states can do. Where maybe federally we can't get certain places that we'd like to go. What can states like Illinois? What can we do? So let's first talk about SEC versus CFTC. Maybe Nathan, what do you think?
So there's this brewing debate right now of is your token a security or not? And Chairman Gensler takes the view that 95 to 98% of the tokens out there are securities, and there go 1933 securities law applies. On the other hand, you have this brand new industry that's saying, look, we have a new digital innovation product here that doesn't apply. And neither side is willing to acquiesce to the other. You hear from the SEC all the time, come in and register, come in and register. Well, and I know some of you have heard this joke before, but for those of you who have seen Return of the Jedi, it's like Admiral Akbar, the Rebel Alliance leader, who says, it's a trap. Well, if you go talk to the SEC, it could be a trap. So what's going to happen? Well, we have a Loomis Gillibrand bill that's out there, and the state of play right now is that, look, outside of a chance of a stablecoin bill coming out later this year, I'm not so much bullish on that. I think it's going to get pushed off. But you have momentum going into 2023. If you think of where the policymakers are, the ones that don't get crypto and don't get Web3, they're probably at about a 4 out of 10. The policymakers who've been studying this for the last year and a half, it's about a 7 out of 10. Because the industry, and this is FTX, this is Coinbase, these are the associations, have done an excellent job educating policymakers this year. It's just going to have to wait for next year for that fruition to come. And does the SEC move forward? Chairman Gensler said even this morning that he wanted to start new rules regulating crypto exchanges. Or does Congress move forward? We think Congress is going to do something next year, but we're going to find out more of the details as we get into the debate of what a Congress looks like next year.
Yeah, and I think that's a great summary. And I think what's interesting, in my practice that I'm seeing is we're really coming to kind of a head of a lot of our clients are asking, is this a security or not? That's kind of the question that a lot of lawyers like myself we're getting is yes or no, black or white, is it a security or not? And that is a complicated question. I think we're looking for some direction from the regulators and from Congress, and I think some kind of regulation will be helpful. Guardrails, so to speak, would be helpful. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that the sort of regulation through the enforcement, as I think Commissioner Pham said, like that, whether that is a good thing, or is that sort of just the way that politics works? How do you all feel about how the SEC is approaching this sort of creating this regulation around cryptocurrency right now?
Go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
I mean, I have probably a slight bias, being that the entirety of my career has largely been in derivatives, and the project that we work on is all derivatives based. So we've taken an approach as the foundation behind Hero Network to proactively open dialogue with the CFTC, but more around the kind of incumbent regulatory stack that exists in the United States today. And obviously, as a distributed network, we focus heavily on a global basis. So largely, not everything's non-U.S. for the most part. So there is a lot of interesting things that are happening there, and it's kind of a tangential conversation, I think, to the whole coin token, whether it's a security or not, SEC versus CFTC. And from our perspective, the way that we see it is that you have this existing incumbent stack, which is really for derivatives a DCO layer with the DCM on top of it, and then FCMs, IBs, kind of being the more Main Street facing entities. And then you have this new FTX direct clearing concept that hopefully we see get pushed through the CFTC relatively soon. And then you have the lane that we're focusing on, which is DeFi. And we think there's an interesting precedent being set by FTX, which really more than anything is a signal from the regulators that they're willing to look at the technologies that exist today and where we could push off in 5, 10, 20 years from now, and how those apply. And I think that approach, like we've seen, at least I've seen from the CFTC, and also having a very positive feedback loop between, I had the pleasure of speaking with Commissioner Pham, and we have an advisor that works with us named Chris Perkins, who is a former head of derivatives at Citi, and it's been a great liaison for us. And what I've realized is that approach of focusing on the innovation and really creating more of a safe environment for us to approach regulators and work through these problems. Because the bottom line is they don't necessarily have a clear understanding of what all of this is. They only see what's on the surface, and I understand for the most part, their job is to kind of protect Main Street, and which is needed. But that approach versus a regulation, by enforcement, I see as probably the way forward and a way to work much more cohesively with this new industry.
Well, if you think there's a lack of understanding there on the federal level,
I can't even imagine.
State level, talking to anyone about cryptocurrency immediately now, it's completely changed in the year and a half. I introduced a bill that would basically allow for existing banking charters in the state of Illinois and also new banking charters to hold crypto assets. They would have to follow the exact same regulation as any type of banking charter that we have in the state of Illinois. And for a lot of our Illinois-based banks, IDFPR is the boots on the ground that reviews all of their records and make sure that they are in compliance. And since Treasury came out with that white paper where they said essentially, if you are a state chartered bank or a federally chartered bank, you can hold crypto assets, that bill became somewhat mute. But even though it is a regulation bill that was endorsed by the bankers, by industry, by consumer protection. A year and a half ago, that bill got 50 sponsors on it, very easily, unanimously passed the House. And if I were to bring that bill up right now, just because of everything going around cryptocurrency, the pushback would be intense. And I've seen the pushback intensify as it's gone to the other chamber and kind of languish there. So it's interesting when you talk about the state level, because we want to do something, because the federal level we're not doing anything. Shocking, right? I mean, like, give me a list of things that the feds don't do that states feel like they need to step in on. But the tide has really changed, and I think that if we can just get ahead and talk about smart regulation and have these larger conversations with all the stakeholders, it's going to benefit the industry as well as consumers.
I do, one more thing I want to say is that I don't think enough attention is paid on the whole KYC, like in the regulatory discussion.
Sure.
To me, that's the most important piece. There seems to be this battle between these two kind of clans, right? Is it a commodities securities, SEC, CFTC? But what about DOJ? And one of the things that we think most about building a decentralized network is, really what exists at the application layer and the user-facing layer, and are there ways to innovate there around know your transaction versus KYC? Like, do you necessarily need to know who that end user is?
Sure.
Is it more important that you keep bad actors and funds or anything of value that comes into your infrastructure out versus needing to know who that person necessarily is? And I think some of the innovations around blockchain, just kind of circling it all back, are the levels of transparency that you get through blockchain technology actually allows that to exist.
And that seems like, one thing I wanted to follow up and ask is that seems like something that would be useful for legislators that are not familiar with cryptocurrency. And I'm sure, Margaret, I should ask, how are those conversations when you have those with your colleagues who are resisting, cryptocurrency? Where do you start? Because I think what could be helpful for any builders who are in the room, or stakeholders who are either investors or investors in space, how do those conversations go so they can understand, the approach that you're taking?
Yeah, I mean, first thing is that I don't say crypto. I usually say blockchain.
Sure.
Because crypto has become like
it's
a dirty word.
Yep.
So I talk about blockchain. We talk about what an actual blockchain is.
Yep.
It's changed a little bit now, but it's still, I get a lot of fraud questions. I get a lot of questions. Silk Road was the big thing a year and a half ago that everyone brought up. Now everyone brings up the Colonial Pipeline situation. I try to give examples of how actually in a lot of cases those things are traceable. But that's where the conversation usually veers off to, and I have to always go into, for the bills that I'm trying to do, industry, I think for the most part does want regulation. They just want clear regulation. And so you can like cryptocurrency or not like cryptocurrency, and I try to not get the opinions going on that side or fight about that. I'm not a true believer, to be frank. But I talk about, this is a regulation bill. If we have good regulation, it's good for industry, it's good for the consumer, it's good for the business, but it's a regulation bill. And I think when my colleagues hear me continually say regulation, 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 they feel more comfortable. And like I said, I think that regulatory bills and regulation can be supported from everyone, as long as they don't hinder the industry too significantly and people feel like the bad actors are being pushed out.
And I would just add, from the federal level, the first half of 2023 is going to be really fast, because you have the SEC moving forward. And I would argue that the SEC is moving forward because there is bipartisan warmth to doing something. It's not a partisan issue. It's more of a generational issue.
That's a really good point.
The policymakers that are, the outreach that the industry's done this year has momentum. So now the SEC is moving forward really quickly. You hear these in the statements of Chairman Gensler. We're going to come back, more likely than not, Republicans will control one or two houses or chambers next year. So they're going to rewrite, but again, it's not a partisan issue. So this momentum is going to lead towards legislation. But who moves first? Well, also remember, you've got an SEC Ripple case out there. You've got a new Coinbase insider threat case, or insider threat DOJ investigation, which lists 9 tokens as securities. So you have all these bits and pieces, and they're all going to have specific catalysts. And these catalysts are going to change the narrative. Be very careful on Twitter, because the Twitter noise really doesn't show what's actually happening. So watch out for those catalysts. Those 3 pieces are going to be moving. And by this time next year, more likely than not, 2 out of those 3 catalysts will have gotten to a point where we know what the regulation is going to look like. It may not be implemented, but if you're a builder or an investor, you at least will have a 2 to 3, 4-year horizon that you know what the rules are.
Okay, great. I want to see if anybody has any questions at all in the audience. Sure.
How do you match the light speed of blockchain adoption with kind of like the slow bureaucratic nature of like government agencies or government entities? Because I just imagine both the introduction of kind of like what blockchain is and also kind of implementing it through policies must be difficult. So I'd just be curious, any insights there?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we just are not on a legislative side and the state. We're just not quick enough, and then the legislation becomes mute for the most part. Some things, I introduced a bill that would allow for your taxes to be paid in crypto, but through a third party, similar to like a credit card payment. That may not go away, but like the charter situation, that's going to be preempted by anything we do federally. I will say states are faster than the feds, but not significantly. I want to add, the one thing I know that states are going to probably be looking at, especially blue states, is environmental regulation around mining. So I urge people who are in that space to get in front of it in a good way. Shanghai Systems, I know, is talking a lot about renewables and using renewables for their mining, but that's where the conversation, at least on my end, at this like local level, is really going.
And I would just add, from the federal level, the SEC or CFTC, if you ever see them conduct a rulemaking, that rulemaking usually takes about 18 months.
Yeah, that's
There's
rulemaking.
a comment period, so forth, 18 months, and then you would probably have about a year implementation period after that. The legislation, if it passes next year, will say to the regulators, go forth and implement. Regulators will probably need about a year to figure out what that means, and then you're looking at 18 months. Mm-hmm. So it took, Dodd-Frank was 2010, it was 75% complete 9 years later.
Yeah.
What do you guys think should be the priority from state or federal level? There's obviously the Lummis Gillibrand bill is sort of trying to regulate around mining and stable coins, but what do you think should be the priority? Do you think that is a good priority, or do you think there are other topics that are in the industry that are more important?
For us at a state level, the priority is that the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation give existing banking charters clear understanding of what they need to do to stay in compliance at a state level. And that's not legislative. That is purely like you have your bank examiner, boots on the ground, mm-hmm. and they need to give guidance, and it needs to be clear. And they know that, so that's coming very soon. And they also have to have bank examiners as well as staff who are fluent in kind of the cryptocurrency blockchain world. So they're working on that because we do see Illinois as a more friendly state for that type of, those types of deposits, I'll say.
Sure.
I mean, I have a lot. I do, going back to the whole KYC,
Yeah.
AML thing, I think that probably far and away is the most important aspect to be focusing on, because the worst thing that could happen to us as in my case, as a DeFi network, is finding out that mm-hmm. you have bad actors floating around and you're not taking at least, some level of base precautions mm-hmm. to help mitigate that. I think that's one. I think there's tons of questions around taxation issues that need to be addressed that maybe isn't specifically regulatory, but it's definitely a state and federal aspect. And I really think those are probably the two most important. And then at the end of the day is just basic fraud. But these are things that exist in traditional markets just as bad.
Right.
And you do need to protect Main Street to some level, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't throw the innovation out because you have a generational gap between politicians and an industry that's trying to move forward.
Sure.
So.
And the last thing I'd say is the industry wants regulation. They want to know what the rules are. And so I think Congress needs to give them what the rules are so that as you go forth and innovate, you at least know how it's going to work. Real quickly, I had a gentleman come up to me and he said, what Caribbean island is the best island to avoid all US regulation?
Yeah.
I said,
I get
I
that question
can't
too.
tell you that, maybe the one with the best drinks. But his whole point is that he was not going to step foot in the United States until he knew what the rules were. And that's innovation that we've lost.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't think the answer is, I don't think the answer is, well, these are the laws that exist, and so you have to
Right.
follow these rules. It's let's be able to challenge these in a positive way.
Yeah.
To see what needs to change so we can stay ahead and so you can open up
Sure.
this space for innovation. Otherwise, it's going to end up being so restrictive and it moves so fast and there's so much convexity to the technology that
great
once you're behind, you're not catching up.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions?
Hello? There. So I had a quick question, well, maybe not so quick, but I think you each just answered it. I'll ask it anyway, which is, so when you have these policies and regulations that are in the ether, I mean, you questioned whether, is it a security or not? That's important. The KYC AML is also important. Is there a concern about some of these regulations or policies being put in place by people who don't necessarily understand the innovation of the space
Yes.
that will then say, no, I'm going off to the Caymans because I can innovate there? So it seems it's not a chicken and an egg, and I understand the need for some of the regulation, but does everyone else share the concern that any regulation may have a butterfly effect that would stifle some of the things we don't even know that we're going to invent yet next?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on that. We work with some fairly large, well-known law firms, and a lot of the discussion is around especially a few years ago, and now it's a little deeper understanding of things, but everything was based on a risk-based approach.
Yep.
And trying to weigh what's your risk of doing something this way because there was no prescriptive guidance. And again, it goes back to that, the answer is not, well, these are the rules, so you have to follow them. You do have to follow them in the context of the United States, but now everybody just avoids the United States. And you try to avoid it, and you geo-block and do everything you can to keep everybody out from the US. And, what needs to evolve? And part of it is you have this issue of people that they're closed off right now still. I mean, 12 years since the day Bitcoin was created, and still being closed off and somewhat obtuse to not necessarily shutting the rules down, but thinking about how to evolve them to catch up and allow us to maintain the trajectory that we're on from a technology perspective. So.
No, go ahead.
I would just add, the White House announced just a few weeks ago that nobody who owns crypto can work on crypto policy.
That's, yeah.
The SEC has similar rules. So the way you combat that is through education. And you educate in a way that doesn't fall into the SEC trap that I alluded to earlier, but you do that through going to Washington, talking to policymakers. They don't know what Web3 is. They think crypto, they think digital assets, they think stable coins. So you combat that through education, and you consistently go back and you educate and educate and educate, because the staffers that you educate today will grow up to be chiefs of staff, and they'll grow up to be Congress, and they'll grow up. And so the education that you do today will pay dividends 10 years from now.
Sure.
And so, it's a challenge. It's frustrating when you see the headline, but that's essentially, there is ways of going about and ensuring that you are protected.
Anyone else?
Hi, Sewan at Chiral. I had a question about future-proofing, possibility of future-proofing by issuing STOs, stable token offerings, rather than ICOs.
I haven't heard the ICO, if that, I mean, it's definitely not quite a thing as far as I know from the space, but I don't quite see it like the way, like I think that was something that was very prevalent a couple years ago.
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer on that. I mean, the Loomis-Gillibrand bill obviously was the first stake at trying to distinguish what was a security, what was not a security. We would argue that, the Howey test remains. And so even if the Loomis-Gillibrand bill were to pass, we could see a scenario where 2 years from now, the CFTC and SEC disagree. And so, I don't know specifically in that case, but it's over the next 6 to 9 months, you will at least have a better answer than you would have today.
Hey, this is a question for Dan. I'm a little hero fanboy here. So,
Thank you.
question on like the TixWix model and the simplicity of how that works. Like, do you just see that infiltrating once this gets kind of cleared of the simplicity of that going into not only DeFi but gaming? On just we're basically kind of betting on everything.
It's a good question.
That's why I asked it.
I think we don't think about things like the end state UI at this point. It's where we're focusing on is very much in the plumbing layer. And so part of that idea was generalizing, kind of asking ourselves, what is the definition of a derivative and where can those be applied? And if you look offshore, at platforms like Betfair, let's say, they now look like trading platforms. And if you think about who the largest liquidity providers are, they're generally some offshoots of large trading firms. And so there is this kind of kernel, like there's this seed that's planted that you start to think about, like, can you merge like data on, like now sports gambling has become legal pretty much everywhere. And
Very legal in Illinois for a
okay,
while.
yeah, there you go.
Nice revenue generator.
Yes, and as that grows and there's market-making desks, is there a bona fide reason to hedge? So does that create an opportunity for a derivative that could actually be regulated? And so I think these are things that maybe are 3 years, 5 years out before they need to be really paid attention to, but we're thinking about building for 3 to 5 years out, and also until we get a generational change, can start have very serious conversations around evolving regulation in the US. But yeah.
We're out of time.
Oh.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.